We're now at the fifth part of this lecture, where we're going to start by talking about interviewer and mode effects. So again, another class of the names of types of things that we call whenever we see different types of survey responses. So interviewer effects tend to have to do with the nature of the conversation between the interviewer and the person being interviewed. And in particular, you can imagine that if you think of this as a conversation partner, you might have different expectations, say, of what a female might want to hear, or what a female might be offended by, or confused by, as opposed to what a male might be. You could imagine the same thing with race, age, right? Any characteristic of a person, a sort of social characteristic that makes us have a different type of expectation. Class is another one, right? Accent. So in essence, that people are going to be responding differently to their interviewer based on what they expect. Interestingly, these expectations don't seem to vary as much across respondent gender. So it's not like females and males are treating female interviewers differently. They tend to be more related, again, to the gender or the race or the other types of aspects of the interviewer themselves. So for example, with male interviewers, there tends to be more positive economic evaluations and, interestingly, more reports of farming activity. People who are speaking with male interviewers tend to report more traditional work-related gender attitudes. Again, expecting that that might be something either they feel comfortable sharing with a male interviewer, but they wouldn't with a female, or that they believe they would be uncomfortable sharing their actual more liberal attitudes. What's tricky about this, of course, is that we're back to the issue. It's not entirely clear what the true attitude is, because so much of that attitude ends up being a result of this delicate conversation and what other people expect. Now, that also tells us that probably what we would expect men and women to do would depend a lot on, say, whether we would expect them to act in a more liberal way or a more conservative way with respect to gender might have a lot to do with who the boss was. So a female boss might actually have different create different sorts of expectations than a male boss. Again, more pro-women activists attitudes with female interviewers. Female respondents actually refuse female interviewers less often. So males, that's one of the few where you actually have an interaction between the respondent gender and the interviewer gender. There's all sorts of gender effects actually on sex attitudes and behavior studies, not surprisingly. It turns out that even just mentioning the name of an older female relative can change sex attitudes, so it's not that surprising that you see a pretty big impact on those types of surveys. Race of the interviewer, again, set of social expectations, can also have an impact. So when you have black respondents and white interviewers, the black respondents become more likely to endorse positive evaluations of Republicans and whites. Of course, when you have a black interviewer, that means they're much less positive. Now, again, we aren't so sure. Is this because there's an expectation that the black reviewers will be sort of disappointed in these black respondents, or is it because they're afraid the white interviewers will be angry at them? Not at all clear. They basically, interestingly enough, become more likely to agree that blacks don't have the power to change things when black respondents, when they have a white interviewer. Also more likely to agree that blacks can't make a difference. So there's a sense of fatalism that for whatever reason creeps in. Again, not so clear if that's trying to signal we don't pose a threat, or finally expressing some inner feeling of fatalism, or an actual fatalism that comes about because of the interaction itself and the sense of power dynamic at play. Very difficult to interpret, would require more basically experimental work to see what was going on here. Or maybe different types of measures. Less likely to agree if blacks form a political party, less likely to agree the whites keep black down. So again, all these types of changes are sort of in a consistent direction. Interestingly, they are more likely to respond incorrectly to political knowledge questions. So in essence, the same people who might actually have quite a good deal of political knowledge suddenly lose it, in essence. So this is very similar to what we think of a stereotype threat. So women who get reminded that they're women do worse on exams. Interestingly, Asians who get responded that they're Asians do better on math exams, right? So this is the sense of, in essence, the stereotype itself can promote a certain type of behavior, even if it isn't what one would do in the absence of that stereotype. With white respondents and black interviewers, there's a slightly different dynamic at play. And here, the white respondents become more likely to endorse liberal or pro-black racial attitudes. So you can actually see a shift of 46% in support for interracial marriage, which is, I think, just shockingly large, and it shifts of over 30% in school and neighborhood integration support questions. So these are questions that aren't as asked as often now, but used to be asked on earlier studies. One thing that I should actually mention with response to race of interviewer is that it turns out that this is most likely, we feel somewhat confident this is about the expectations of the person being interviewed and not the way that the interviewer is asking the questions. Because if you compare basically the race of the interviewer, in some cases people were asked what race they thought the interviewer was, and you were able to basically compare people. If these were over the phone, it was black interviewers who had sort of didn't have a black sounding voice, as it were, who sort of spoke in a certain way, as opposed to those who did. So it turned out it was what the respondent perceived the race of the interviewer to be, not the actual race of the interviewer, that has a lot of these race of interviewer effects. There's at least one or two studies I'm aware of on that. Some other interviewer effects are more of an interaction. Basically, if the respondent and the interviewer have similar education, similar backgrounds, they're likely to refuse. This is similar to the gender. Two females are less likely to refuse. And interestingly, more confident and self-aware interviewers actually have lower unit and item non-response, especially on complex surveys. So in essence, these interviewers are able to lead their respondents through these more complex surveys and in essence have an authoritative sense about them that keeps people responding, perhaps even after they're tired and bored of this somewhat demanding survey. The example that I showed you before, I'm just going to show a few examples here of the social isolation question. So this is the 1985 GSS versus the more recent 2004-2010 GSS, where people are asked to give the names of the people with whom they discuss politics. And the actual numbers then are that the social isolation increased initially. They found this between 85 and 2004. In particular, the number of people giving zero names went from 10% to 23%. The mean size of the network shrunk, but shrunken networks were less common when question appeared earlier in the study. In addition, these order effects, so in essence, people were as fatigued when they got to those questions, gave more names. But in addition, there were significant interviewer effects where a few interviewers basically had none of their respondents gave any names because the interviewers, it turned out, at least one and then maybe two or three more had done it some of the time. So one had basically had never asked these questions, and two or three had asked very few of these questions. So what you find is the sort of tiringness of the study, and the interviewers themselves ended up having significant effects. Now, we've talked about interviewers. Let's think a little bit about mode. So the mode of a survey here, again, remember, is it face-to-face? Is it pen and pencil? Is it online or on the web? Is it over the phone? Part of mode effects of self-administered surveys can be quite positive. So they can reduce issues with social desirability and acquiescence bias because you don't feel as much if you're the person being responded that the other person is going to be sitting there judging you for what you say. So in essence, you might think these to be somewhat freer of these sort of demand effects or social desirability effects. But the problem is that you also lose all the motivation to continue in this conversation because you feel like you owe it to the other person or whatever it is that's going on. And so you end up with basically higher item non-response, and you have more measurement error because people make mistakes, they stop paying attention. And that's particularly true as the survey gets longer. So again, you get basically somebody might be able to answer an hour and a half long survey face-to-face. Over the phone, it might only be 45 minutes. Online, 15 to 20 minutes tops tends to be the length. And as you get longer, you tend to have significant roll-off, which means people stop sort of taking the survey at some point. So the later questions never get asked at all. And that missing data poses a potential problem because you don't know what causes people to roll off, or we have some idea, but we might not be able to measure it. We can't use basically any of the missing data. You can't impute it the way you could if you were just basically if this data were missing completely at random. It's a more sophisticated statistical approach, but they can be used to deal with some types of missingness, but not necessarily whenever it's missing for a reason, but you can't measure what that reason is. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that, for example, the name generator and interpreter questions, like the GSS one that I just mentioned about social networks, can be given in a way that's actually much shorter online. So in my own research, I have a way that I administer those questions that while they might take 15 to 20 minutes face-to-face, they take about 90 seconds to get both done by allowing people to sort of very quickly fill in names and quickly fill in a grid of characteristics. And preliminary research and analysis suggests that people are quite accurate. Maybe you lose a tiny bit of accuracy, but people are pretty good at knowing, okay, this person's a relative, this person's a Democrat, and checking off the boxes. So they don't lose motivation, and in fact, you get a lot more information than you would if you were only able to ask this one question face-to-face. There could be others in general. By using things like grids, which we'll talk about, you can go through questions more quickly and get more, in a sense, bang for your 20 minutes or bang for your buck if you're paying for that 20 minutes than you could. The same questions might take much longer face-to-face. Another type of mode effect can be on the sample or unit non-response. So, for example, mail surveys typically have very low response rates, often under 10%. Even when you've got follow-ups, the census is a huge problem. Think of the census as a mandatory survey, and the first time it's sent out, you get some type of response because people feel obliged, and there's actually a law that says you have to respond. But even then, it can take, for some people, 20 or more follow-ups, and even then, that you don't always get a full response. In fact, this is one of the reasons that samples that are used to basically collect that census information can actually be more accurate than the actual census because of this a unit no response. With internet panels, however, you need a lot of weighting. So you can't do basically any type of calculation with a lot of internet panels, and increasingly, unfortunately, with most other studies as well. But you need to have a way to deal with self-selection. So again, there's very sophisticated statistical techniques that are required to deal with self-selection into the sample when we think about the fact that they aren't going to be perfectly representative of the population if not everyone is responding. On the other hand, you've got face-to-face surveys are very expensive. You can get the highest response rate. So in the traditional sort of older times, things like the NES and the GSS used to have 70 to 80% response rates, and very, very high. They've gotten lower now overall, but with enough time and energy, you can get it up to at least 60%, whereas many times other types of studies, 20% if you're lucky and it's a reputable source. If it's a marketing survey, you might have 3%. So you can end up quite large. And a problem that has become increasingly an issue, though actually, interestingly enough, has started to be dealt with quite effectively, though it took us a while to get there, is the issue with landline surveys versus mobile. So now you've got this issue, if you can imagine, where you've got the stratified population where some people have mobiles only, some people have landlines. You've got to figure out a way to sample, but you aren't sure what the actual distribution looks like, because it's not like everyone house has one. You aren't being able to sample on households and phone lines because you've got all these multiple lines within the same phone. You've got different, so sampling becomes sort of a bit of a mess under those conditions. But there have been ways, again, statistical approaches in which we've tried to describe these populations and figure out how to sample effectively from them. As you can imagine, though, of course, hiring people out to do that is somewhat expensive and costly.